Hey guys, Sko here. X-Men Explained returns with a fan favorite, Wolverine. We're going to talk about Wolverine, a couple important things about his kit, and we're also going to be talking about attacks and attack events and cards that affect the damage of those events, because I think it's just helpful to have a little primer on that. So when we look at Wolverine, one of the things we're going to see first is our setup ability, Snikt. Set up, search your deck and discard pile for the Wolverine's Claws upgrade and put it into play. So yes, kind of the elephant in the room, or something that I find personally hilarious, is that after your mulligan, if your claws are in your hand, Logan cannot find his claws in his hand, and you do not get to put them into play, and it is a forever unplayable card because it has no cost. That is technically true because setup abilities occur after setup, and this ability does not list the hand as a place that it can search. So, as amusing as that is, we know that the intended way to play is to somehow have Wolverine's claws in play before setup triggers, before mulligans even happened. And we've been told almost directly just to do that. Once we heard that they were going to add rules to the permanent keyword to say that they enter play early. So that's personally the working understanding that I'm kind of going with, that if a hero has a permanent upgrade, I put that into play at step 1, the same time as the ID. And that's been working okay for me. And then I just have the setup with, but it doesn't matter. So I've gone ahead and sleeved this card in a different sleeve. I'm not going to deal with technically doing the mulligan correctly. So you can resolve that however you like, but you know, I just think it's funny that he can't find it in his hands. So if you want to keep living that life, go ahead and do that. But I'm just going to have it start in play even before the beginning of the game. So two important parts of Wolverine as a hero are his hero side ability, Healing Factor. It's a response after the player phase begins, heal 2 damage. So this is an optional response, so don't forget about it if you really want to be a stickler. Keep in mind that it happens after the player phase begins, so it's not at the beginning of your turn. So in a multiplayer game, it's going to happen right at the beginning of the player phase. So at the beginning of the first player's turn, whoever it is, you're going to heal 2 damage off of Wolverine's hit point style. And then we've got the claws, which we're going to talk about for a while because it's a huge part of his kit and probably the most like rules odd inclusion. So it's permanent, means it can't be discarded, can't be blanked. As a hero action, exhaust Wolverine's claws, choose an attack event in your hand, and take damage equal to its printed cost arrow. So all of that is a cost. It must all be performed. Then play that event, ignoring its resource cost. That attack gains piercing. So a couple things to note about this. You cannot perform this if you cannot pay the cost, and taking damage is in the cost of a player card here, which means the damage has to actually be reduced from your hit point dial. So if you are tough or you prevent this damage somehow, you actually fail to pay this cost. So because it says you must take the damage, it means the damage needs to land on Wolverine. Thankfully, we don't really mind taking damage because we heal every turn. A couple other things to note. You play that event, which means things that trigger off of the event being played are going to trigger. One really common example of this is going to be Clobber. So Clobber is an attack event, and it says, if this is the first card you have played this round, return this card to your hand. If you trigger this with Wolverine's Claws as the first card you play, you did play it and you get to return it to your hand. So Clobber is one of my favorite cards to use with the Claws, with Wolverine for this purpose. It says play that event, ignoring its resource cost. Another important thing is that you are not paying the resource cost at all. You cannot overpay. You cannot be considered to have paid a certain resource type. You ignore the resource cost entirely. So that has a couple of non-bows in the card pool. So some examples here. Anything with the requirement keyword. Requirement says that you must pay a certain resource type when playing the card. When using Wolverine's Claws, we are playing the card. which means playing a card with requirement with Wolverine's Claws is impossible. So you cannot play No Quarter with Wolverine's Claws. Similarly, basically any event with a resource kicker is not going to trigger off of Wolverine's Claws, and you cannot trigger it. So Relentless Assault says deal 5 damage to a minion. If you paid for this card using a physical resource, this attack gains overkill. You can play this with Wolverine's Claws, nothing's stopping you from doing so, but you will not get that second sentence. You cannot pay a fist and trigger it. You're ignoring its resource cost. And Dropkick, kind of similarly, it says deal 4 damage to an enemy. If you paid for that card using only physical resources, stun that enemy and draw 1 card. So you can play this with the claws to deal 4 damage, but you will not get that second sentence. You did not pay for that card using only physical resources. You did not pay for it with any resources at all. So that's something important to keep in mind, especially when you're deck building with Wolverine. Your resource kickers and the claws do not work well together. So another thing to keep in mind with the claws is some events cause multiple attacks. And I'll talk about some of Wolverine's. But one example in our signature kit is Slice and Dice. So it has the attack trait. So it is something you can play with Wolverine's Claws. It just chooses an event with the attack trait. Okay, so it does not need the attack label per se, although those are almost always together. Slice and Dice is an example of when they are not exactly. Just needs a card to have the attack trait. Anyway, Slice and Dice says, hero action, make the following 2 attacks in order. Deal 3 damage to an enemy, deal 3 damage to an enemy. So this is a fairly rare case of one event causing multiple attacks. And something that is a little confusing about how these cards interact, particularly with Claws wording, is the effect of Claws says, play that event, ignoring its resource cost. That attack gains piercing. So we ask ourselves, okay, what do we do in the case of one event that has multiple attacks? It is not evidently clear from the text of the card, but it has been ruled to us that the piercing applies to the first attack caused by this event. So in the case of Slice and Dice, if you play it using Wolverine's Claws, the first attack, deal 3 damage to an enemy, will gain piercing from the claws, and the second attack will not have piercing, and the effect will expire. Slice and Dice being 2 attacks matters for a number of reasons. If you hit a retaliate enemy twice, you'll get retaliated both times if neither kills them, and it's going to trigger a bunch of things. This could trigger Yarn Bjorn 2 times. We're going to circle back to events that are multiple events in a second. I'm also going to talk about another event in our signature set, which caused us a lot of headaches trying to understand how this works, especially back when, there was a time when multiple sentence costs were super confusing. That has mostly been sorted out, so I am fairly confident that we have a kind of good understanding of how this event works, which I'm sure I'll regret saying that sooner or later. But Berserker Barrage, it has the attack trait. Hero action attack, deal 4 damage to an enemy. If this attack defeats an enemy, you may take 2 damage. Cost arrow, repeat this ability. So the main thing that makes this card extremely odd is that a lot of its text is a cost. And that matters because you must be able to pay the cost in order to play the card. It's also in order to play cards in Marvel Champions, the effect of the card needs to be able to change the game. So there was a time when we thought that this card was maybe unplayable because its effect was nothing or would only create other effects. So it has been ruled that the effect of this card, repeat this ability, can be considered to change the game because repeating the ability would involve dealing 4 damage to an enemy. So basically, even though the repeat this ability, it will consider the costs of that repeated ability when it thinks about whether it will be able to change the game. So on the one hand, the effect of this card is always considered able to change the game. Remember, the card doesn't need to actually change the game to be played. It just needs to have the potential to change the game. So you are not forced to repeat the ability, but you can play the card because you always could theoretically repeat the ability and deal 4 damage to an enemy. On the other side, the cost side, You can only play a card if you can pay its cost, but this card is once again, a fairly rare example of an optional cost. So it says, if this attack defeats an enemy, you may take 2 damage. You are not required to be able to pay optional costs in order to play a card. So it is legal to play Berserker Barrage when you have fewer than 2 health remaining, or if the attack is not going to defeat an enemy. All you need to be able to fulfill is the non-optional portion of the cost, which is deal 4 damage to an enemy, which you can almost always do. But there could be some odd situations where you're not able to. Another very odd thing about a lot of this card being a cost is when you are stunned. Stun replaces the effect of an attack. It does not replace the cost. So attack events like this that do their damage in a cost is a cheeky way to get around stun. You can play this card while stunned. You will still perform the cost. You'll deal 4 damage to an enemy, and you may pay the additional cost. I don't recommend doing that because the effect, repeat this ability, will get replaced by stunned. And in that case, you were able to deal damage even though you did not successfully perform an attack. So that is Berserker Barrage as we understand it. If you have more questions about this card, go ahead and ask. It has caused us all kinds of headaches. I hope I have been clear in my explanation so far. There is no limit to the number of times that you can repeat it. The repeats are additional attacks. They're separate attacks. So the claws, for example, would only give piercing to the first instance of Berserker Barrage. It will not give piercing to repeats. Abilities that affect only one attack will only affect one of the attacks. And they all are counted as separate attacks. They will get retaliated separately. And it has all of those kind of associated baggage, which I'm going to talk about that a little later. We're going to circle back to this card just like Slice and Dice. But, if you have more questions, please ask. I know there's a lot to dig into with this card. Also, another ruling that I thought I would share about is our signature ally, Jubilee. She has an ability response. After Jubilee enters play, choose an enemy. Until the end of the phase, while Wolverine or Jubilee is making a basic attack against that enemy, they get +2 attack for that attack. So really strong ability. It is really fun to build these very wombo combo-y decks in leadership that involve readying her and Wolverine and recurring her, sometimes multiple times around. It has been ruled that if she enters play multiple times around, her response will trigger multiple times and it will stack. That was already evidently true of Wolverine. So if you play Jubilee 2 times and you choose the same enemy with both response, Wolverine will get +4 attack against that enemy each time he makes a basic attack against them. It also has been ruled to apply to Jubilee, even though that Jubilee is a new instance. For some reason, that also applies to Jubilee. So if you choose the same enemy 2 times with Jubilee, Jubilee will get +4 attack against that enemy each time she makes a basic attack that round, or that phase. So that is a great, super strong combo, really fun kind of build around concept, and that's just a really ruling that made this card even more powerful than it was. Good stuff. All right, so that was most of our discussion of Wolverine signature stuff. What I want to talk about next is a group of very similar effects in Marvel Champions that affect the damage of events and attacks, and kind of talk about how those work similarly or differently in different situations, because it can be, I totally understand it being confusing because there are a lot of effects that are worded extremely similarly, but end up working very differently because the very slight differences in these wordings end up mattering. And it's something you're going to run into with Wolverine probably a lot, and just, I figured it'd be worth talking about. So, the basic dividing line to keep in mind is some of these kind of effects affect events, and some of these kind of effects affect attacks. And as we've already seen, those are not always correlated. Every event is not only one attack. So an example of one of those type of things is Warrior Skill. Warrior Skill's ability says interrupt. When your hero attacks, remove 1 warrior counter from here. that attack deals 1 additional damage. So, in the case of a normal attack, that is, pretty self-explanatory. A basic attack, or basically any event that only has 1 attack and 1 instance of damage on it, you will increase that amount of damage by 1. Because it's additional, it's going to be the same instance of damage, just increased in amount by 1. This gets interesting in the case of events that are 1 attack but multiple instances of damage. So a prime example of that is melee. Melee is a hero action attack, deal 3 damage to an enemy, period. Deal 3 damage to another enemy, period. So this is 1 attack, but it has multiple instances of damage. And it has been established that effects like warrior skills apply to all instances of damage on whatever thing they are affecting. So triggering warrior skill when you play melee will cause both of its instances of damage to be increased by 1. You'll deal 4 damage to one enemy, and you'll deal 4 damage to another enemy. Those are not separate attacks. You don't need to spend 2 counters. You cannot trigger warrior skill twice, even if you wanted to. You can trigger it once, and you'll do 4 and 4. Warrior skill is going to interact differently with an event that is multiple attacks. So an example is Slice and Dice from our signature set that we talked about earlier. This looks extremely similar to melee, but and many times it's going to be very similar. It's more flexible in that you can damage the same enemy twice, but it's also different in being 2 separate attacks. So that means when you trigger warrior skill playing Slice and Dice, kind of similarly to how the claws only provide piercing to the first attack, you can only trigger warrior skill to affect 1 of these attacks at a time. So you can play Slice and Dice, and then you're going to attack by doing the first bullet point. At that point, you may trigger warrior skill, and you will increase that instance of damage to 4. Then you will do the second attack, which is not going to be affected by warrior skill because it is a separate attack. Because it is a separate attack, you may trigger warrior skill again and spend a second counter to make that one increase to 4 damage. You also may choose not to and instead have it only do 3 damage. So warrior skill is kind of worse to combo with Slice and Dice than it is with melee, because melee being 1 attack kind of lets us double dip on our warrior skill usage. Also keep in mind that warrior skill is triggered when you attack, which could be triggered only on the second use of Slice and Dice. So you could play Slice and Dice, do its first attack, deal 3 damage to an enemy, choose not to trigger warrior skill on that, then perform the second attack of Slice and Dice, and when you are about to attack, you may trigger warrior skill and increase that one to 4 damage. So warrior skill and the last sentence of Wolverine's clause are examples of these kind of abilities that affect attacks. Another fairly common effect you're going to see is very similar wording that affects entire events. So an example of this is the new resource card, Aggressive Energy. It has a hero interrupt. When you spend this card to play an attack event, which is an event with the attack trait, keep in mind it doesn't necessarily require the label, that event deals 1 additional damage. So similarly, in the case of an attack event with 1 instance of damage, it's very straightforward how that works. It just increases that instance by 1. Because it says additional, it is the same instance, just dealing 1 more damage. But this gets pretty spicy when we play it on cards like this. So on melee, Aggressive Energy is going to have the same overall effect that spending 1 counter of warrior skill does. This event, dealing 1 additional damage, will actually apply to every instance of damage on melee. Once again, it's not abundantly clear in the rules why exactly that is the case. It's just been ruled that that's what this text means. When such and such a thing deals 1 additional damage, it applies to all instances of damage caused by whatever thing is being affected. So melee deals 3 damage to an enemy, Aggressive Energy will increase that to 4, and then melee's second sentence, deal 3 damage to another enemy, Aggressive Energy will increase that to 4, because it is affecting the entire event. That event deals 1 additional damage. It'll work on melee, which warrior skill would have anyway. The one that's different is Slice and Dice. Spending Aggressive Energy to play Slice and Dice will affect both of its attacks because Aggressive Energy affects the event. So when you make the following attacks in order, the first one, deal 3 damage to an enemy, Aggressive Energy will increase that to 4. and then you'll do your second attack, deal 3 damage to an enemy. Aggressive energy will increase that one to 4, because it doesn't only affect one attack, it affects an event, okay? So similarly, Berserker Barrage is going to interact in a really similar way to these two kinds of effects. Warrior Skill will affect each instance of Berserker Barrage separately. You can choose to trigger it or not to trigger it, and triggering it on one does not carry over to repeats. They are separate attacks. So it's just kind of like, very much like Slice and Dice in that way. But Aggressive Energy works positively with Berserker Barrage. When you repeat it, you are still playing the same event. It is only one event. So Aggressive Energy will double dip and cause that attack event to deal 1 additional damage. So another card with a really similar effect to Aggressive Energy is Honed Technique. It will never affect these guys because Honed Technique needs to affect aggression attack events. But just as another common card that we're going to play, I thought I would mention it. When you play an aggression attack event, if you paid for that card using a mental resource, increase the amount of damage that event deals by its printed cost. So it says event, so it works like aggressive energy. So it will double dip on melee like usual. It would also double dip on an aggression event that does multiple attacks. I don't think we have one of those right now, but if we did, Honed Technique would affect multiple things. It definitely double dips on things like melee and Dive Bomb, of course. One other thing to talk about these guys, as long as we're talking about Wolverine, is keep in mind that in the case of Wolverine's Claws, we're not paying resources for the event that we play with the Claws. So you cannot use Aggressive Energy to, you cannot spend it and gain its ability for an attack that you are using Wolverine's Claws to pay for, because you are ignoring its resource costs. You did not spend this card to play an attack event. Similarly, even if you're playing an aggression attack event, you are playing an aggression attack event, but it is not possible for you to pay for that event using a mental resource if you are playing it with the Claws. So these kind of cards are awesome and fun, but they're a little bit of a non-bow with the Claws, so keep that in mind. All right, that concludes the things that I had queued up to talk about Wolverine and attacks. There is a lot to kind of dig into here, so if there are more things you have questions about, please drop a line in the comments or find me on Discord somewhere. I'm always happy to discuss these things and answer some questions. If anything I said in this video turns out to be wrong, I'll be updating it probably with a comment saying that I was dumb and said something wrong. If you have any more questions, let me know. And in the meantime, have fun playing Wolverine and tearing up the villains. Peace. See you next time.